So we're very happy to have Julia Pohle, or Pohle, how do you pronounce your name? I'm sorry.
Pohle.
Pohle, join us from all the way across town, or actually across Mitte, well, maybe not very far away at all, the VZB. So welcome very much to the Center for Digital Governance here at the Hertie School. So Julia is a senior researcher in the research group Politics of Digitalization at the VZB in Berlin at the Social Science Center, and a senior associate researcher at the Center for Digitalization, Democracy and Innovation at the Brussels School of Governance. So are you in Berlin, or are you presently in Brussels?
No, I'm in Berlin.
Okay, right. Okay, good. It's good to be close. But anyway, her research focuses on discourses and narratives in international and national digital policy debates and the shifting role of national states in shaping global communication governance. She currently serves as chair for the Communication Policy and Technology at the International Association for Media and Communication Research, and is an academic editor for the journal Internet Policy Review. So in the last couple of days, we just had the rebooting of our digitalization Stammtisch, and we just had a meeting between the presidents of Estonia and Germany on what Germany could be learning about digitalization. And we had a big conversation about what that means for democracy too. So I think this is an incredibly timely talk, and I'm really glad that she could join us. And so we're looking forward to it. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yes, I guess so, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, and I should mention this is being recorded, but don't worry if you don't like having your questions recorded, because we will turn the recording off before Q&A. So only the talk is recorded.
Okay. Thanks. So let me start by sharing my screen, which we just tried, and it should work now. There we go. No, it doesn't. Sorry, for me it doesn't, because I don't get to see what I should. Yeah, here. Now I don't see you anymore. I'm so sorry. We just tested it, and now, yes, now it works. Okay. Well, thank you a lot for having me in this series of talks. I saw the program. I'm sorry I missed most of the others before me. I hope to be able to join a few which are still coming. And I will be talking today about Europe and about digital sovereignty, which are kind of the two topics which I'm currently working on. I am myself a kind of interdisciplinary scholar. I have a background in cultural studies, philosophy, and computer science, and I did my PhD in communication studies. And I kind of combine all these different disciplines and the concepts and theories coming out of these disciplines in my research. Although most of the research I'll be presenting here today is really inspired by communication studies, and especially by discourse studies. But also, as the title says, we'll be touching up in kind of questions of geopolitics and geoeconomics. So what I have been doing over the last couple of years really primarily was looking at discourses of digital sovereignty. And I think most of us have heard this term many, many times. But what I think most people who do not deal or like really look into digital sovereignty questions a lot often forget is that digital sovereignty, or the concept of sovereignty, has a long history in digital governance. I can't move my slides, so there we go. So the discussions around the idea of state sovereignty, they really have been there from the very early moments of when the digital networks kind of started to spread around the globe. And what we can see over the last 30 years is that there has been some kind of discursive shift in the way we conceptualize sovereignty, with regards to digital networks. So while there has been talk at the very beginning, it really has to do with the fact that digital networks, in particular the internet, were really imagined as something placeless, as something like a space without borders and territories. And so it has been imagined as something that is completely opposed to the concept of the nation state. And it has been also imagined as something that is opposed to the concept of state sovereignty. State sovereignty, which is traditionally understood as the ability to act as a state, both internally and externally, kind of independently, quasi-independently from other states and powers. And the change of the change of the conceptualization, this discursive shift I'm referring to, kind of has occurred because what we see now is that the idea of sovereignty has changed. While we saw it before that the network has to be something which is independent of state sovereignty, so has its own sovereignty. Cyberspace was imagined as a space which had its own sovereignty, which was inhabited by the early internet community in some way, and in which governments and sovereign states had no authority. And now we have the idea that states and governments should actually have sovereignty over cyberspace, and that they should have ways in kind of enforcing their authorities also in the internet and with regarding to digital networks and digital services. Though there has been a conceptual shift, and the term sovereignty, when it's today used with relating to cyberspace or to the internet, has really a very different meaning to how it has been used at the very beginning. And this has a lot to do with shifting imaginaries and shifting ideas about what the internet is and what the internet should be. And this is something I will be coming back in a minute. So since I said I will be speaking about digital sovereignty in Europe, I think it's also good to have some idea of when we started to speak about sovereignty, digital sovereignty in the European space. It's a concept which was really coming out mainly out of France and Germany, but you can say that more or less from 2013 onwards, there are kind of regular calls for more self-determination with regards to digital in Europe. And they have been framed in different terms. So what I will like a lot of speaking about tech sovereignty. There's still a lot of talk about digital strategic autonomy. There are differences between these different concepts. Data sovereignty is also one, but in the heart, they all kind of are related to this large term of digital sovereignty. And in 2019, this was really kind of a key moment. It was the German presidency of the EU Council in its program, which declared that digital sovereignty should be the ultimate goal of the EU Digital Governance Program. And this has been kind of reiterated and reinforced so many times ever since. It almost feels that there are no European digital policy document which doesn't make any kind of some kind of reference to digital sovereignty. And also the policy initiatives that we have been seeing over the last couple of years, they also were always justified in some way with reference to digital sovereignty. And despite this kind of popularity of the term, if you want to, it's interesting that there is no shared definition in the EU, not even on the European level, on the Brussels level, what digital sovereignty really means. It's really a term which has a very, very broad interpretation and no clear definition. I mean, of course, even the European Union kind of brings some definition in different documents, but it's not always the same. And if you speak about to different actors, they would have different understanding and different interpretations of what digital sovereignty really means. And many academic experts who have been dealing with this discourse on digital sovereignty also said this is not a bug but it's a feature of the term. So the digital sovereignty term is so attractive because everybody can attach different meanings and different definitions and ideas to it. And the interesting thing is also that in Europe, digital sovereignty is really used across actors, used by actors across the entire political field, so from all different kind of parties, but it's also really embraced by non-state actors. So the private sector also uses the term, the open source community, which was even actually one of the first ones to really use it, but also civil society is using the term. So it's a really kind of broadly used term with no shared definition behind it. And what comes when we say there's no shared definition, it really means that there is a large range of ideas of what digital sovereignty can mean. And they range from collective self-determination, meaning the autonomy of the state, the security of its IT infrastructures, the competitiveness and the independence of the digital economy, to kind of more individual ideas of self-determination that could be kind of the self-determination, the sovereignty of the users of digital products. It can be the digital competences and the literacy of users, digital users, but also it could be kind of the digital rights of European citizens. This is also linked to the idea of digital sovereignty, and in particular this kind of idea of digital sovereignty being in an individual capacity is very strong in Germany, And this has created also on the European level some confusion, especially among the French and the German, while the French would never understand why sovereignty can be linked to individuals. There is always kind of a collective thing. So this is kind of all in this term and makes this term very fussy in some way. And a second characteristic of the digital sovereignty debate in Europe is that currently, or still, this term is used in a very kind of prescriptive way. It's really used to express aspirations, like of a digital future where we want to get to. It's not really used as a description of a situation that we have today, and it's not really used as a situation that can ever happen. So it's really used to make claims to sovereignty. And to kind of project ideas into the future. If we just strengthen our digital sovereignty, then we will reach something. And of course, despite this prescriptive usage, it's also kind of translated into practices. So especially in the European level, we can see all this platform regulation and data protection regulation that is in some way a translation of these ideas behind digital sovereignty, but all these kind of measures have very clear objectives. So for example, the Digital Markets Act is about a fair and open market. The GDPR is about data protection. So they're not really about digital sovereignty. They're just legitimized and justified with this aspiration to digital sovereignty. And many of these clear objectives behind these measures are also in some way of conflict to each other. So this also creates, kind of adds to the fuzziness of the term of digital sovereignty. And the third characteristic, which I see in the discourse on digital sovereignty on the European level is, and I'm sorry, I'm still having trouble with my slides not advancing. There we are, is that it is, the digital sovereignty discourse is increasingly normatively loaded. So that means that we, in Europe, we can see that digital sovereignty becomes increasingly connected to European and democratic norms and values. It's almost, you see kind of in the language, it's almost digital sovereignty is almost set equal with the protection of European values and the protection of citizen rights, which in my opinion is a complete distortion of the concept of sovereignty, which is not about rights and freedoms, but it's really about autonomy, power, control. So you can see that, say also that many of these claims and these references to normative values in the discourse of digital sovereignty are really used as a normative justification for other purposes. So they're used to justify methods that might actually be motivated by other interests, for example, economic interests or security interests. And all of this kind of accumulates in a digital policy agenda on the European level, which I think, and this is a quote, says what Europe tries to achieve with its method is to create a digital society based on European values and European rules. So what this means is that digital sovereignty is a discourse, it's an imaginary, right? And digital sovereignty, a digital society based on European values and European rules is really an imaginary. So it's an idea we aspire to, but it's not something that is already realized and it is also already existing. But of course, Europe has been adopting measures, policies and regulations that kind of try to bring us to this imaginary. So you can say that this discourse on digital sovereignty really has a performative function. So they are the logics behind all these different directives and regulations that we have been seeing over the last 10 years. And these, since this digital sovereignty discourse is so broad, you can say that all these different policy measures we are seeing are really motivated by a very complex set of economic, social, and geopolitical concerns, which are somehow related to the strive of digital sovereignty. And one of my colleagues, or several of my colleagues in a paper called them, these measures, they called them a creation of hybrid policies combining internal market, fundamental rights, and geopolitical motivations. And this is really something that really also applies to digital sovereignty discourse. It's this mix of different motivations which are behind this discourse and which are behind these measures, which really make them also extremely interesting. So what I was trying to do in my recent research is really to understand where this hybrid mix of motivations comes from. So I really wanted to understand, what is this discourse of digital sovereignty? Like, where does it come from? Is it just a discourse which is actually motivated by what many people argue, by geoeconomic and geopolitical ambitions? Or is it just a normative discourse, as the EU often put it itself, like we want to kind of achieve a situation where we can protect European values and norms? So I usually kind of try to criticize this very normative ambition behind the digital sovereignty discourse, and also say that this is actually, I rather see that most of the things in this discourse are really motivated by geoeconomic and geopolitical interests. But then I started to wonder in my last paper is that are we maybe, when we think about this kind of digital sovereignty being a geoeconomic and geopolitical ambition, are we underestimating the motivations behind it? Am I maybe reducing them to kind of real political interests? Is there not more behind this than just geoeconomics and geopolitical ambitions? And I also started to look at the research that has been done on digital sovereignty and was wondering if we all got too kind of focused on the concept of sovereignty in digital sovereignty. And what sovereignty means in relation to this digital, and how this kind of idea of sovereignty is kind of also contributing to the larger EU geopolitical and geoeconomic ambition. And I started to think that actually maybe what we should really look at to understand where this is coming from, we should look at the digital and digital sovereignty and really understand what is happening in the digital, what has been happening in the last decade in the digital sphere, to understand actually where we are coming from and where we want to get with digital sovereignty, and what are the real motivations, and what do we want to overcome? What kind of challenges do we want to overcome with our strive for digital sovereignty? And this is what I tried to do in a recent paper, and this is what I'm also trying to present very quickly here. So I tried to kind of understand. I'm sorry, there is some strange text on that slide. There is the black text, you can ignore it. I tried to kind of regroup all the motivations I found into a category, like into 3 different categories, which I linked to 3 kind of dependencies that came apparent over the last decade, which the EU, with its strive for digital sovereignty, tries to overcome. And all of these dependencies are somehow also linked to a shift in the belief system behind our digital policies. So the very first one that I identified is the, is the dependency on digital infrastructures. So what you can see is that with the Snowden revelations in 2013, it came off kind of suddenly, there came this sudden realization that the open and free internet that we thought we had, and that the US until today is still pretending that it tries to protect, does not exist, and maybe has never existed. So there is this idea of a free and open internet in which everyone can kind of openly and anonymously and freely share information on an equal level. It never existed. Maybe only in the very early days when there was a very small community of internet users, very homogeneous. And now today it still clearly doesn't exist. And this really came apparent with the Snowden revelations in 2013. And it has been kind of reconfirmed over the time, of course, with all the other events that have happened ever since. So there was kind of this realization that we are really dependent on data infrastructures that are not in our control. And this kind of led to a loss in the belief in the internet openness and the anonymity of the internet, and that the internet is a decentralized network that does not favor certain actors over others, and that does not allow for central control points. We actually realized that there are central control points and that there are some favored over others. So this is kind of the first kind of dependency that is behind the motivations of the European Union for its digital sovereignty discourse. The second one I found in the discourse analysis I did is, of course, that the realization that we are very dependent on tech companies and private actors that provide us with our digital technologies and our infrastructures and the services we use, and they are all primarily based outside of Europe. And so there is this, over the last decade, I mean, this is obvious to all of us, is there is this kind of growing unease with the platform economy. And it has been kind of triggered by disinformation campaigns, by the events happening during the elections in the US and Brazil and many other countries, the Brexit referendum, and so on. And so this realization that this dependency on tech companies and the way they handle our data traffic has led to a loss in the belief in the internet as a global commons. So the idea that the internet is actually a global commons, it can be freely used by everyone without that some benefit more than others. This was kind of the idea, that was kind of how the internet was sold to us in the 1990s. And instead what we see today is kind of walled gardens, lock systems. We see a data economy that is profoundly unequal. And so we kind of lost also the belief in the liberal or the neoliberal governance system behind the internet, which actually allowed these walled garden and lock system to grow. And I think in Europe in particular, Europe realized that it has absolutely nothing to counter this problem. And this is what we can see now in these ongoing regulatory efforts like the DSA, the DMA. They were trying now to get a hand on this and see that we find some way to counter this. And the third dependency that I identified is the realization that we are dependent on structural inequalities. And these have kind of the idea that these structural inequalities have absolutely not been leveled by the digital transformation, but really have been reinforced through data extractivism, through the creation of relationships that are called nowadays often called digital colonialism. So the idea at the very beginning was that the internet would kind of create a global village. It would kind of really help to overcome structural inequalities that have been there for centuries. And that, I mean, that's the discourse of the information society in the 1990s and the early 2000s. If we just kind of would be able to close the digital divide and would allow kind of the developing world to leapfrog into this kind of new society called the information society, thanks to the internet, then we would be all becoming kind of a global and equal society. So we lost the belief in this kind of idea, and we lost the belief in the egalitarian idea of the internet community, so that the internet community is egalitarian in some way. And I think what for the EU was the hardest, that it realized what it didn't expect at the time, like of the discourse of the information society, that it would also be on the losing side of this. I think the EU always believed that it had already kind of, has always been one of the major forces and would be kind of in the first positions in these structural inequalities. And it had to realize that actually all countries are trying to extend some way their influence through the digital economies, through infrastructure projects, through the dominance in data flows, through data agreements, and so on. And there has simply been two countries which are really strong, which is the US, of course, on one side, but also over the last decade, we have seen China. And Europe simply doesn't have a seat on that table. Maybe it only has a seat on the small children tables with some of the other countries like India and Brazil, but it clearly is not among the major players in how the internet is shaped and who's like winning the race for the digital economy competition. So these were like kind of the three dependencies and the kind of three loss of beliefs that I identified, which motivated the digital sovereignty discourse in Europe. And that brings me already to my kind of concluding slide, is that if the EU really wants to have a seat on this table and it wants to play kind of on equal level with countries like China and the US, and that's a stated kind of really objective of the European Union, right? The EU always says it wants to define a European third way of the digital transformation. It wants to create a digital society that is based, I had this slide before, on European values and European norms. It really needs to think about how to do this. Digital sovereignty is clearly not only a geo-economic and geo-political strategy. It is also really a normative strategy, but it has to be more than this. Because if the EU is searching for some kind of new major narrative that would replace all our beliefs we had in the internet with new beliefs. So if we want to kind of replace this narrative of the open and free internet, the equalitarian internet community, the idea that the internet is a global commons, if we want to replace this with new ideas, it has to come up with a very strong concept and a very strong idea how this new kind of digital global order should look like. And it really has to create a narrative that can attract all countries around the world. And I personally don't believe that digital sovereignty has the potential to do this. First, of course, because I think the concept of sovereignty is so much linked to control, and it's also so much linked to the authoritarian countries that it has difficulties kind of to sell the link between European and democratic values and sovereignty. But also, I think Europe also needs to be careful in how it is communicating its ambition to become create this new global digital order. Because if it goes around the world saying we want to bring European values and norms through our regulations and through our infrastructure projects, and there are some, although they're very small, if they want to bring this to the global south, I think in particular in African countries, there is this difficulties that there is a colonial past and a history, and they might not be very welcoming to the idea of bringing democratic European values into their systems again. So they might be much more attracted by the Chinese offer, which is coming with huge infrastructure projects and a very different vision of a digital global order. So this is kind of what I think about digital sovereignty. The EU needs to find an imaginary that is stronger than digital sovereignty if it really has this ambition to define a new global digital order. And if you want to read, this was very short, if you want to read a bit more about how I thought about this and what I said about the EU digital sovereignty discourse, I wrote kind of a few articles on this over the last couple of years. And of course, now I have time for question and answers. Thank you very much.